Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is exceedingly important to understand that we have multiple constitutions in our nation. It is not simply the U.S. Constitution which rules over our lives. Now, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is the final document on everything in this country. But we also have what's referred to as federalism in this nation. Federalism is a two-tier system of government. We have a national government in Washington, D.C., but each and every state also is its own government. We have today 50 laboratories of democracy, and each one of those states has its very own constitution. Many of them have a lot of similarities to the national constitution, but it was the states that had the constitutions first. And it was from these state constitutions that we drew the ideas to create our national constitution eventually. 1776. You have the Continental Congress calls upon the colonies to draft new constitutions. Remember, all of the colonies had existed under some form of royal charter. Well, the Continental Congress is now calling for them to draw up their own written constitutions for how their state is supposed to exist. Thus began the formation of what's known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation would be our first government. It would be a collection of essentially sovereign states. We would be 13 individual states who collectively worked together on things such as defense. And that was about it. Each state at that time, the 13 states, colonies at that time, were each to draw up their own constitution. This would be the document under which those individual states would now exist. Now, Massachusetts contributed one innovation that had really not been thought of before this. They went through and they called a special convention to draft its constitution. This was essentially a constitutional convention. They called together individuals from throughout Massachusetts to get together and draw up the constitution to cover all the things that they felt were necessary. But they went one step further. They made it so that the Constitution could then only be changed through another specially called Constitutional Convention. They went through and set things up in such a way that they were going to create their own constitution, but they also wanted to make sure that they had the ability to change it if need be. If circumstances proved necessary to make alterations to their constitution, Massachusetts wanted to be able to do that, but they wanted to make sure that it was being done only for significant causes. So it wasn't just that a legislature or something could go through and say, all right, this is what's going to be in the Constitution now. No, they'd had to have a constitutional convention in order to write it. If they wanted to change it, they were also going to have to call a special constitutional convention. So this was going to be something brand new that was going to have long-lasting effects on the way we would draw up our Constitution for the nation, and then also would have effects on the way we go through and would alter our Constitution as need be as time went forward. Now, a lot of states had written documents that represented a fundamental law. We think of, as I said, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Nothing done by any level of government today can violate the Constitution in any way, shape, or form. And that doesn't matter if it's something done by the national government, if it's being done by a state government, a county government, the city, even down to the school district. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And this was true for a lot of the states at this time. They had documents that represented the fundamental law. And as I said, each state was quite literally, it's going to be its own sovereign little nation just about. They would go through and they would have for themselves what was the supreme law of the land essentially for Massachusetts or for Virginia or for New York or etc., etc., etc. Many of these documents, many of these constitutions would have a Bill of Rights. Now, we think often about our Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and we think about how important those are with things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right against cruel and unusual punishment, things along those lines. Many of the states have something similar, and a lot of the state Bill of Rights will go through and will look very similar to what the national government has. The idea being that the states were very interested in making sure that the rights of the people would be protected. Remember, when we start writing these, it wasn't the idea that this was just going to be a state to whom would owe allegiance to a national government. This was going to be a state to whom they owed allegiance to the people of their state. It wasn't going to be one nation of 13 parts. It was going to be 13 individuals collectively working together for a variety of ends. So you have all of the documents being written and whatnot, and all of them created weak executives and judicial branches. Okay? Now, we are used to the three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court, for example, or the court system. Same kind of concept was always going on here in the colonies. Okay? You had the colonial legislature, the colonial governor, and the colonial courts. Well, as the states were writing their own constitutions, they tried to make sure that there wasn't a super strong executive, that the governor of the state was not someone who was going to have all of this phenomenal power. Okay? They didn't want the executive to have that, and they didn't want the judicial to have that kind of power. They distrusted either of these two branches having a great deal of power because they saw how that power was abused while Britain was running things. They wanted to try and make sure that, at least in most states, it was the legislative branch that would be given sweeping powers. Now, there were some people who looked at this and weren't 100% sure this was the best idea. For example, Mr. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. He warned, essentially, that 173 despots in a legislature would be just as oppressive as one. If you have some form of legislative body, they can trample an individual's rights as easily as a king could. The framers would be deeply in fear of this. It's something they would refer to often as the tyranny of the majority. So while there were most of these constitutions going through and creating fairly powerful legislative branches with fairly weak governors and judicial branches, there were those who were looking at how these constitutions were being written, how power was being distributed, and they questioned what was happening. They knew there had to be a good way to go about doing this, but they weren't sure that the best way was actually being used at this point in time. Another big change that was happening at this point in time also was that you had state capitals were actually moving, if you could believe that. I mean, we think about Sacramento, for example, in California today. The idea that the state capital might move to a different city seems beyond our ability to even imagine at this point in time. But you've got to keep in mind the population was moving. We had started off as a nation clinging to the eastern seaboard, but now we were moving west. The proclamation line of 1763 didn't really matter that much anymore. And the people were heading west. They were heading to the new lands. So as a result, as people were moving, governments moved as well. You have a number of state capitals moving, such as New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. You have a sizable number of these states relocating their state capitals to new places. Some of this obviously being done because movement of the people. They wanted the state capital to be closer to the center of the population. In other cases, Some of these places were doing so just to have a break of some kind with Britain, to try and make sure that the old capitals that had been in place when they were a colony were not necessarily going to be the same capital now that they were a